The carriage rocked hard as it hit the last bend before Ashcombe Manor, and Eleanor Whitmore gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding faster than the wheels beneath her. She was not afraid of the road. She was afraid of what waited at the end of it. In 3 hours, she would be married to a man she had met only once, a man whose name made grown lords lower their voices when they spoke it, Duke Alexander Ashcombe. Her father had signed the papers a week ago, in a study thick with cigar smoke, while Eleanor stood outside the door and listened to her own future being decided without her. There had been no discussion of love. There had been talk of debts, of a will that demanded marriage within 30 days, of a fortune that would save one family and rescue another. She was the rescue. He was the debt. The carriage stopped. Eleanor did not wait for the footman. She opened the door herself and stepped down onto the gravel, and the first thing she saw was him. Alexander stood at the top of the stone steps, tall, dressed in black, his jaw set like a man attending a funeral rather than his own wedding. He did not smile. He did not move toward her. He simply watched her climb the steps alone, as if testing whether she would falter. She did not falter. "You are late," he said, when she reached the top. "I was told the ceremony begins at noon. It is 1:45. Then you are early for something you clearly do not want to attend." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Neither do you, Your Grace. At least we agree on that." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. He turned without another word and walked inside, leaving her to follow or not, as she chose. She followed. She had no choice, and she hated that more than she hated him. The chapel was small and cold, lit by candles that did nothing to warm the stone walls. There were no guests but the priest, a steward with a ledger under his arm, and 2 witnesses who looked as though they wished to be anywhere else. Eleanor stood beside a man who would not look at her, and she said her vows to the side of his face. When it came time for the ring, his hand was steady, hers was not. He noticed. He said nothing. "You may kiss the bride," the priest said, and the words hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander leaned in, brushed his lips against her cheek instead of her mouth, and stepped back before she could react. It was not a kiss. It was a formality performed with the least possible effort, and Eleanor understood, in that moment, precisely what kind of marriage she had entered. A transaction, nothing more. That evening, a servant showed her to a bedroom far from the master suite, at the opposite end of a long, dim corridor. The room was handsome but unused, the fireplace cold, the bed made with sheets that smelled faintly of dust. "Will His Grace be joining me?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. The servant, an older woman with kind eyes and a guarded mouth, hesitated. "His Grace keeps to his own wing, my lady. He has for many years." "Even for his wife?" "Especially for his wife," the woman said, and then seemed to regret it. "Forgive me. I only meant—" "You meant exactly what you said." Eleanor managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you for your honesty. What is your name?" "Mrs. Prescott, my lady. Housekeeper of Ashcombe Manor these 20 years. "Then you have seen a great deal, Mrs. Prescott." "More than I care to speak of," the housekeeper said, and left Eleanor alone with the candle, and the cold, and the silence of a house that did not want her. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not. Not on this night. Not for a man who had not even tried to hide his contempt. Instead, she unpacked her trunk herself, hung her few dresses in the wardrobe, and lay awake listening to the wind test the windows. Somewhere in the house, she heard footsteps pass her door and stop. She held her breath. The footsteps did not knock. They moved on, slow and heavy, toward some other part of the manor, and Eleanor was left wondering if her husband had come to see her at all, or if she had only wished it into being. The next morning, she rose before the sun and went looking for the kitchens, unwilling to wait for a servant to bring her breakfast in a room that felt more like a cell than a chamber. She found instead the study, its door left ajar, papers scattered across the desk in careless piles, ledgers stacked crooked against the wall. It was the room of a man who had given up on order. She should have walked past. She did not. By the time Alexander found her there an hour later, she had already sorted half the desk into neat stacks, dust rising into the morning light, like small ghosts disturbed from their sleep. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, dangerous. Eleanor did not look up from the ledger in her hands. "Your accounts are 3 months behind, Your Grace. Your tenant rents are recorded in 2 different hands, which tells me your steward is either overworked or careless. I suspect the former. I did not ask for your opinion of my household." "No," Eleanor agreed, finally meeting his eyes. "But you married me for my father's money, and money left unmanaged has a habit of disappearing. I would think you'd want someone to notice before it does." For a long moment, he said nothing. His hands, she noticed, were clenched at his sides, the knuckles white. "Leave my study," he said finally. "As you wish." Eleanor set down the ledger, careful to leave it in the neat pile she'd made rather than the chaos she'd found. "But you will find, Your Grace, that I do not frighten easily, and I do not intend to spend the rest of my life being ordered out of rooms in my own home." She walked past him, close enough to see the muscle tighten in his jaw, and did not look back. He did not call her back either. But that evening, when she passed the study again, she saw through the half-open door that the ledger remained exactly where she had left it, untouched, unruined, the neat stack still standing. He had not undone her work. It was such a small thing, it should not have mattered. And yet Eleanor found herself thinking about it long after she had gone to bed, turning it over like a stone worn smooth by water, searching for what it meant that a cruel man had chosen, quietly, not to be cruel about that one thing. Days folded into a week, and then 2. Eleanor learned the rhythms of Ashcombe Manor the way one learns the moods of a difficult horse, through patience, through careful observation, through the refusal to be thrown. She learned that Alexander rode out alone every morning before the household woke, returning hours later with mud on his boots and something unreadable in his face. She learned that he ate dinner in silence, that he answered questions with the fewest words possible, that servants moved around him the way people move around a sleeping animal, careful not to wake something that might bite. She learned, too, that the manor had a garden once tended with love and now left to ruin, roses gone wild and choked with weeds, a stone bench half swallowed by ivy. She asked Mrs. Prescott about it. "That was the young master's garden," the housekeeper said, her voice dropping the way it did whenever the past came too close to the present. "Master Charles, His Grace's brother. What happened to him?" Mrs. Prescott's hands twisted the corner of her apron. "An accident, my lady. Years ago now, the lake, in winter, the ice was thinner than anyone knew." She stopped herself, as if she'd already said too much. "It is not my place to speak of it further. Was Alexander there?" The silence that followed told Eleanor everything the housekeeper would not say aloud. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor took a candle and walked the length of the cold corridor toward the garden door. The air outside was sharp with early frost, and she wrapped her shawl tighter as she stepped onto the overgrown path, following it toward the stone bench beneath the dead roses. She was not alone. Alexander sat there in the dark, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing, a man who looked, for the first time since she had known him, entirely unguarded. "You should not be out here," he said, without turning. "Neither should you." Eleanor kept her distance, unsure whether to stay or retreat. "Mrs. Prescott told me this was your brother's garden." His shoulders went rigid. She had no right. "She told me almost nothing, Your Grace. Only that it was his, and that something happened to him. The rest you have made very clear yourself, simply by never coming here in daylight." He turned then, and in the pale wash of moonlight, she saw something in his face she had not expected. Not anger. Grief, old and unhealed, worn down to something quieter and more dangerous than rage. "Go inside, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her name. She did not move. "Not until you tell me why you're sitting alone in a dead garden in the cold, instead of sleeping like a reasonable man." Because reasonable men do not lose their brothers to their own carelessness, he said, and the words came out sharp and sudden, as though they had escaped before he could stop them. Then his mouth closed hard, and she understood the conversation was over whether she wished it or not. "I don't believe that," Eleanor said quietly. "You don't know anything about it." "No," she agreed, "but I know grief when I see it, and I know that a man who blames himself for an accident does not deserve to be alone with it forever." Alexander stood abruptly, the movement sharp with the kind of anger that comes from being seen too clearly. "You know nothing of me. You are here because your father needed my name and I needed your money. Do not mistake this marriage for something it is not." The words landed exactly where he meant them to. Eleanor felt them, a small cold blade beneath the ribs, and she let herself feel it fully before she answered, because pretending it hadn't hurt would have been its own kind of lie. "You are right," she said finally, her voice steady even as her chest was not. "I am here because of a contract. But I am also a person, Your Grace, whether you find that convenient or not, and I intend to remain one for the rest of however long we are bound together. You may hate the marriage. I will not ask you to pretend otherwise, but you will not make me disappear simply because my presence is inconvenient to your grief." She turned and walked back toward the house before he could answer, her spine straight, her hands trembling only once she was certain he could no longer see them. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps, no voice calling her back. But the following morning, when she came down for breakfast, she found a single rose, trimmed, imperfect, clearly cut by unpracticed hands from the wild tangle in the garden, set beside her plate, with no note and no explanation. She did not ask him about it. He did not offer one. But she kept the rose in a glass of water by her window for the rest of the week, and each time she looked at it, she found herself wondering what it might take to coax something alive out of a man who had spent so long convincing himself he deserved only ruin. It was not forgiveness. It was not even kindness, not yet. But it was a beginning, however small, however unwanted by the man who had planted it, and Eleanor Whitmore, now Eleanor Ashcombe, was not a woman who let a beginning go to waste. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider in fine livery who refused to say who had sent him. Eleanor found Alexander in the study, with the paper in his hand and fury written plainly across his face, the kind of fury that had nowhere safe to go. "What is it?" she asked. "My cousin." He said the word like a curse. "Edmund Halloway has decided to remind the world that our marriage was arranged, as though half the marriages in this country were not built the same way. He is telling anyone who will listen that our union is a sham, that it was never meant to last, and that the estate should therefore pass to him instead of remaining in my name." Can he do that? He can try. If enough people believe him, he can petition to have the marriage examined, perhaps annulled, and if that happens, everything my father built and everything you brought into this house goes to a man who has done nothing but wait for me to fail. Alexander crumpled the letter in his fist. He has been waiting since my brother died. He thinks this is his chance. Eleanor watched him carefully. There was something new in his voice beneath the anger, something closer to fear, though he would never have named it that. "Then we will not let him have his chance," she said. Alexander looked up, surprised by the certainty in her tone. "This is not your fight. It became my fight the day I signed my name beside yours, Your Grace, whether either of us wanted it to." She stepped closer, close enough that he could not look away from her without it being obvious that he was avoiding her. "Your cousin wants people to believe there is nothing real between us. The only way to prove him wrong is to give them something they cannot dismiss." "And what would that be?" "A wife who does not flinch, a husband who does not hide." Eleanor held his gaze. "Lord and Lady Pemberton are hosting their autumn gathering next week. Every family who matters in this county will be there, including, I imagine, your cousin. We will attend together, and we will not give them a single crack to pry open." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You are asking me to perform a marriage I do not believe in, for an audience I despise." "I am asking you to protect what is yours," Eleanor said simply. Call it whatever helps you agree to it." He did not answer for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost against his own will, "Very well." The week that followed was strange in a way Eleanor had not expected. They practiced, in small and awkward increments, the shape of a couple who might actually belong to each other. He offered his arm at dinner, stiffly at first, and she took it without comment. She asked him questions about the estate that had nothing to do with proving a point, and he found himself, more than once, answering at length before catching himself and falling silent again, as though surprised by his own willingness to speak. One evening, walking the garden path that had slowly, under her care, begun to look less like ruin and more like neglect on the mend, he stopped beside the stone bench and studied her in the fading light. "Why do you not hate me?" he asked. The question caught her off guard, honest in a way his questions rarely were. "Who says I don't? You would have every right." Eleanor considered this. "I do not enjoy your coldness, Your Grace. I do not enjoy sleeping at the far end of a cold corridor while my husband avoids the sight of me. But hatred takes energy I would rather spend elsewhere, and I have seen enough, in these past weeks, to know that your coldness is not the whole of who you are. It is only the part you show most easily. You know nothing about the rest." "Then tell me," she said, "or don't, but stop pretending there is nothing beneath it, because I have seen the rose you cut for me, and roses do not grow from nothing." He did not answer that night, but he did not walk away either, and they stood together in the dying light until the cold finally drove them both inside. The Pemberton gathering was everything Eleanor had feared and prepared for in equal measure. The great hall glittered with candlelight and old money, and the moment she and Alexander entered together, arm in arm, she felt the room's attention shift toward them like a tide changing direction. Edmund Halloway found them within the hour, his smile sharp as a blade disguised as courtesy. He was a handsome man in the way that made people trust him before they had reason to, and Eleanor understood immediately why his lies had found such fertile ground. "Cousin," Edmund said, bowing slightly to Alexander before turning his attention fully to Eleanor. "And the new Duchess. How does married life suit you, my lady? I do hope the arrangement has proven more comfortable than the circumstances that created it." "Marriage suits me very well, Mr. Halloway," Eleanor said, her smile as pleasant and unyielding as his own. "Though I confess I am curious why the circumstances of my marriage concern you so deeply. One might almost think you had a personal stake in seeing it fail." A ripple of interest moved through the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Edmund's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "I only wish to see my cousin's affairs conducted with honesty," he said. "It would be a shame if this county discovered that the Ashcombe marriage was arranged for convenience rather than affection, and that the current Duchess had married a man who could barely stand to look at her." The room went very quiet. Eleanor felt Alexander stiffen beside her, felt the old instinct in him to retreat, to let the silence answer for him the way it always had. She would not allow it. "Mr. Halloway," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear clearly, "I imagine you have spent a great deal of time constructing that particular story, since it requires ignoring rather a lot of evidence to the contrary. My husband rides out before dawn to see to the well-being of every tenant on this estate personally, a habit few dukes bother to maintain. He has restored wages that had gone unpaid under prior mismanagement, and he sat with me only last week discussing improvements to the tenant cottages before winter arrives. I would ask you, sincerely, what precisely you have done for the people of this county beyond spreading stories designed to take a title that is not yours." Edmund's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for those watching to notice. "I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant," Eleanor said, softer now, almost kind, which made the words land harder than shouting could have. "And I think everyone here understands it as well." She turned to Alexander, offering her arm, and after a heartbeat of stillness, he took it, his expression unreadable to everyone but her, who saw the faintest flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or might have been shock at being defended by someone who owed him nothing. They walked away together, leaving Edmund standing alone amid a crowd that had, for the moment, quietly turned against him. Later that night, in the carriage home, Alexander sat across from her in silence for a long while before speaking. "No one has ever done that for me," he said finally. "Done what?" "Fought for me, publicly, without being asked." His voice was low, uncertain in a way she had never heard from him. "My father demanded loyalty. He never earned it, and no one ever gave it freely, least of all to me. I did not do it only for you," Eleanor said honestly. "I did it for myself as well. Your cousin insulted us both, and I will not stand quietly while a man like that decides what my marriage is worth." "Still," Alexander said, and stopped, as though the next word cost him something significant. "Thank you." It was such a small thing, 2 words offered stiffly across a dark carriage, and yet Eleanor felt them settle into her chest with more weight than she expected. When they arrived home, he walked her to her door, which he had never done before, and lingered a moment too long before turning to leave. "Alexander," she said, using his name for the first time without his title attached to it. He turned back. "Your brother's death," she said carefully. "You do not have to tell me tonight, or ever, if you are not ready. But I would like you to know that whenever you are, I am willing to listen without judgment." For a long moment, he said nothing, and she thought perhaps she had pushed too far, too soon. Then, quietly, in a voice stripped of all its usual coldness, he spoke. "Charles wanted to skate that morning. I told him the ice was too thin, and I refused to go with him, because I was angry with him over something so small I cannot even remember what it was now. He went alone. I found him 3 hours later, when he did not return for supper." Alexander's hands were clenched at his sides, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent every winter since wondering what would have happened if I had simply gone with him, angry or not." Eleanor did not reach for him, though every instinct told her to. She understood, somehow, that he needed to say the words more than he needed to be touched while saying them. "That was not your fault," she said simply. "You don't know that. I know that a boy going onto ice against his brother's warning is not the brother's fault, no matter how the guilt has convinced you otherwise." Her voice was steady, gentle, but firm enough that he could not dismiss it. "You have carried this alone for years, Alexander. You do not have to carry it alone tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face, and for the first time since their wedding day, Eleanor saw not the cold duke the world feared, but the grieving young man beneath him, still waiting, after all this time, for someone to tell him he was allowed to be forgiven. He did not answer. He simply nodded, once, and pressed his hand briefly over hers, where it rested on the doorframe, a touch so brief it might have been imagined, before turning and walking back down the long, cold corridor toward his own wing of the house. Eleanor stood in her doorway long after he had gone, watching the space where he had been, and understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that something between them had shifted that night in a way that could not be undone. Whether either of them was ready to admit it yet was another matter entirely. Winter arrived early that year, frost climbing the windows before the last leaves had fully fallen, and with it came a strange, fragile peace that Eleanor had not expected to find inside Ashcombe Manor. Alexander still rode out most mornings, but more often now he returned before noon rather than disappearing until dusk. He still ate dinner with the same quiet reserve, but he no longer ate it alone in his study, choosing instead the long table where Eleanor waited, and speaking, sometimes, of things that had nothing to do with debts or duty. It was not courtship. Neither of them called it that. But it was something, and Eleanor found herself watching for it the way one watches for the first green shoot after a long frost, uncertain whether to trust it, afraid that naming it too soon might cause it to wither. Edmund Halloway, however, was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter delivered not to the manor but to the local magistrate, a copy of which found its way, by means no one could quite explain, into the hands of half the gossiping households in the county within a single week. The letter claimed to contain correspondence between Eleanor and a fictitious suitor from before her marriage, suggesting that she had entered into her union with Alexander purely for the title and fortune it offered, with every intention of maintaining an attachment elsewhere. The letters were forgeries. Eleanor recognized this the moment Mrs. Prescott brought her a copy, her hands trembling with the indignity of it. "My lady, I do not believe a word of it, not for a moment, but the whole county is talking." "I know." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt as she read the fabricated words attributed to her, phrases she had never spoken, sentiments she had never held, all constructed with just enough detail to sound plausible to those who wanted to believe the worst. "This is Edmund's work. It must be." She found Alexander in the study, the same letter already spread across his desk, his face unreadable in a way that frightened her more than open anger would have. "You've seen it," she said. "I have." "It is false, Alexander. Every word of it. I have never corresponded with any suitor, before our marriage or since. You must know that." He looked up at her, and for one terrible moment, she saw something she had not expected to see in his eyes. Doubt. "Do I?" he said quietly. "I know very little about the life you lived before you came here, Eleanor. Your father arranged this marriage in a matter of weeks. I never asked what you left behind to enter it." The words landed like a slap, worse for how calmly he delivered them. "You cannot possibly believe this." "I do not know what to believe," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite accusation, but was not trust either, a wound reopening in real time. "I have spent my whole life being lied to by people who claimed to care for me. My father, my cousin, even Charles in his own way kept things from me that might have saved his life had he trusted me with them. Forgive me if trust does not come easily. Then trust the evidence of the past 2 months, instead of a letter written by a man who has spent his entire adult life trying to take what is yours." Eleanor's voice shook now, not with fear, but with a hurt she had not expected to feel this deeply. "I have given you honesty since the day I arrived, even when honesty cost me. I told you your accounts were a mess. I told you I did not hate you when I had every reason to. I stood in front of the entire county and defended a marriage I had every right to resent, and I did it because I believed there was something worth defending. If that is not enough to earn a moment's benefit of the doubt, then I do not know what would be." Alexander said nothing. The silence stretched long and cold between them, and Eleanor understood, with a sinking clarity, that the old walls he had spent years building were not gone. They had only been quiet, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure to test whether they still held. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course," Eleanor said, and the coldness in her own voice surprised her. "Take whatever time you need, Your Grace." She left the study without another word, and did not come down for dinner that evening, nor the evening after. The days that followed were among the hardest since her arrival at Ashcombe Manor. Alexander retreated fully into the silence she remembered from her first weeks there, and Eleanor found herself once again eating alone, walking the garden alone, lying awake in the cold room at the far end of the corridor, wondering whether the small, fragile thing that had grown between them had truly been strong enough to survive its first real test, or whether it had only ever been an illusion born of proximity and loneliness. Meanwhile, Edmund Halloway grew bolder. He began appearing at local gatherings without invitation, dropping careful remarks designed to fan the flames of doubt he had already lit. He called on the magistrate personally, requesting a formal inquiry into the legitimacy of the marriage, citing the forged letters as grounds for suspicion. He was, Eleanor came to understand, a man who had spent years learning exactly how to destroy something without ever appearing to be the one holding the match. It was Mrs. Prescott who finally brought Eleanor the piece of information that changed everything. "My lady," the housekeeper said one evening, finding Eleanor in the garden despite the cold, "there is a stable boy, young Thomas, who has been troubled these past days. He came to me this morning, unable to keep the secret any longer." "What secret?" "He was paid, my lady, by a man matching Mr. Halloway's description, to deliver a sealed letter to the local printer some weeks past, along with instructions on how it should be copied, and where it should be sent. He did not know what the letter contained at the time. He only understood, once the gossip began, what he had unwittingly helped to create. Eleanor felt something sharp and clarifying move through her, cutting through the fog of hurt she had been living in for days. Will he say this to the magistrate? He is frightened, my lady, but I believe, with the right encouragement, he might find his courage. Then we must find it for him, Eleanor said, already moving toward the house. Where is the letter he delivered? Did he see anything of its contents, or the hand that wrote it? He said the hand was elegant, my lady, more elegant than a stable boy could describe in detail, but he did recall one thing, the wax seal. He said it bore a hawk in flight, which he found unusual enough to remember. Eleanor's breath caught. She had seen that seal before, stamped into the corner of an invitation delivered to the manor weeks earlier, an invitation Edmund Halloway had sent under his own signature. She found Alexander in his study that same night, for the first time in 5 days, and set the invitation down on his desk beside the forged letter that had caused so much damage between them. Compare the seals, she said, without preamble. Alexander looked at her for a long moment before lowering his eyes to the desk, studying first one document and then the other. His face changed slowly, the color draining from it as understanding took hold. This is my cousin's seal, he said quietly. Your stable boy Thomas was paid to deliver the forged letter to the printer. He recognized the seal on the note that accompanied his instructions. He is frightened, but Mrs. Prescott believes he can be convinced to speak to the magistrate. Alexander sat back slowly, the weight of what he had allowed himself to believe settling visibly onto his shoulders. Eleanor, I should have trusted you from the start. I let my own history poison what stood plainly in front of me, and I am ashamed of it. You should be, Eleanor said, and though her voice was not unkind, it was not soft either. I understand where your doubt came from, Alexander. I understand the shape of the wounds that made you quick to expect betrayal rather than loyalty. But understanding is not the same as excusing it, and I will not pretend the last 5 days did not hurt, because they did. I know. He rose from his chair and came around the desk, closer than he had allowed himself to come in weeks. I cannot undo what I said. I can only tell you that I was wrong, and that the fear that made me doubt you had nothing to do with anything you did, and everything to do with the parts of myself I have never let anyone close enough to see clearly. You saw them anyway, and I punished you for it. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the memory of the cold days that had followed his doubt. What happens now? Now, Alexander said, we take this evidence to the magistrate ourselves, before my cousin has the chance to bury it. And then, if you are willing, we begin again the work of trusting each other, properly this time, without the walls I have spent so long insisting on keeping. It was not a simple reconciliation, and Eleanor did not pretend it was. The wound from those 5 silent days would take longer to heal than a single conversation could manage. But she recognized, in the rawness of his apology, something she had not yet seen from him. The willingness to be wrong out loud, without the armor of pride to soften the admission. Very well, she said finally. We begin again. But Alexander, hear me clearly. If doubt comes for you again, and I suspect it will, because old wounds do not vanish simply because we wish them to, you will bring it to me directly, rather than retreating into silence. I would rather face your fear with you than be shut out of it entirely. I promise, he said, and for the first time, she believed the word carried real weight behind it. The visit to the magistrate the following morning was tense but decisive. Thomas the stable boy, coaxed gently by Mrs. Prescott's presence at his side, gave his account with trembling but clear honesty, confirming the seal, the payment, and the instructions he had been given. Combined with the physical evidence of the matching wax impressions, the magistrate declared the forged letters fraudulent and opened a formal inquiry into Edmund Halloway's conduct. Word spread through the county faster than the original scandal had. By the following week, The same drawing rooms that had whispered doubts about the Ashcombe marriage were whispering instead about Edmund's disgrace, and the tide of sympathy that had briefly turned against Eleanor turned fully back in her favor, strengthened, if anything, by the revelation of what she had endured. Edmund himself vanished from local society within days, retreating to a distant property to avoid the humiliation he could no longer outrun, his claim to the estate destroyed along with his credibility. But for Eleanor and Alexander, the greater victory was not the public vindication. It was the quiet, difficult work that followed in its wake. The long conversation by the fire one evening, in which Alexander spoke more openly than he ever had about his father's coldness and the impossible standards that had shaped his own inability to trust. The morning Eleanor found him waiting for her at breakfast, having risen early, not to avoid her company but to seek it out. The evening he asked, hesitantly, whether she might consider moving her things to the rooms nearer his own, not out of obligation, but because the long, cold corridor between them had begun to feel, to both of them, like an unnecessary distance. She said yes. It was not a declaration of love. Neither of them was ready yet for words so large, but it was a choice, made freely, by two people who had begun, slowly and against every instinct either of them had been taught to trust, to build something real out of what had started as nothing more than a contract neither of them had wanted to sign. Peace, Eleanor would come to learn, was never something a man like Edmund Halloway accepted without one final attempt to burn it down. He had disappeared from society for nearly a month after the magistrate's inquiry, and in that time Ashcombe Manor had settled into something Eleanor had not dared to hope for at the start of her marriage. Alexander no longer rode out alone every morning without a word of where he was going. He began some mornings to ask if she would join him, and she began, most mornings, to say yes, the two of them crossing frost-covered fields together while he pointed out which tenant families needed which repairs before the worst of winter arrived. It was not romance in the way the novels described it. There were no declarations, no poetry, but there was a steadiness growing between them, a habit of turning toward each other rather than away, and Eleanor found she trusted that steadiness more than she would have trusted any grand words. Which was precisely why, when the second scandal broke, it struck so much harder than the first. This time, the attack was not aimed at Eleanor's fidelity, but at the legitimacy of her birth. A pamphlet appeared, circulated anonymously through the county's finer households, suggesting that Eleanor's merchant father had purchased false documentation years earlier to obscure a low-born origin unsuitable for marriage into a ducal family. If true, the pamphlet argued, the marriage itself might be void under old inheritance law, a technicality obscure enough to sound plausible to those eager to believe it. There was no seal this time, no careless stable boy to trace the letter back to its source. Whoever had orchestrated it had learned from the first failure and covered their tracks with far greater care. Eleanor recognized the strategy immediately for what it was, not an accusation aimed at destroying her reputation directly, but one aimed at destroying the foundation of the marriage itself, striking at something a magistrate's inquiry could drag out for months, tying up the estate in legal uncertainty regardless of whether the claim was ultimately proven false. "It's Edmund again," Alexander said grimly, pacing the length of his study, while Eleanor sat very still, the pamphlet in her lap. "It must be. No one else stands to gain from questioning the marriage's legal standing." Perhaps Eleanor's voice was quieter than she intended, or perhaps it does not matter who wrote it, only what it will cost us, regardless of whether it is proven false. "What do you mean?" "I mean that even if we prove this claim baseless, as I have every confidence we can, the process may take months, during which every family in this county will treat our marriage as a question mark rather than a fact. Your tenants will wonder if the estate remains stable. Suppliers may hesitate to extend credit while the legal standing of the household is in doubt. And she stopped, the weight of it settling on her fully for the first time. I will spend those months as a woman whose very right to sit at this table is publicly disputed, regardless of the truth." Alexander stopped pacing and looked at her, something shifting in his expression as he seemed to truly register, for the first time, the scale of what she stood to lose in all of this, far beyond what he himself risked. "I will not let that happen," he said. "You may not have a choice, Alexander. Some fires cannot simply be commanded to stop burning." That evening, exhausted and raw from the weight of the accusation pressing down on her, Eleanor found herself doing something she had not allowed herself to do since her arrival at Ashcombe Manor. She began to seriously consider leaving. Not permanently, perhaps, not forever, but the thought crept in regardless, quiet and insidious. If her presence in this marriage had become a liability rather than a support, if the very fact of her birth was now a weapon being used against the household she had worked so hard to help restore, perhaps the kindest thing she could do, both for herself and for Alexander, was to remove herself from the fight entirely until the dust settled. She said nothing of this to him, but the thought took root, and by the following week, when Alexander grew distant and preoccupied with meetings she was not invited to attend, meetings with lawyers and family solicitors that he explained away with vague reassurances, the seed of doubt bloomed into something heavier. "He is protecting the estate," she told herself. "He is not protecting me." It was an unfair thought, perhaps, born more of exhaustion and old fears than of anything Alexander had actually done. But fear rarely waits for fairness before it takes hold, and by the end of the week, Eleanor had made a decision. She would return, temporarily, to her father's house. Not as an abandonment, she told herself, but as a retreat, a way to remove herself as a target while the legal question resolved itself, sparing Alexander the distraction of worrying for her safety and reputation while he fought to protect what remained of the estate's standing. She packed a single trunk, quietly, and arranged for a carriage to collect her at dawn before the household woke. She did not get far. Alexander found her in the entrance hall, just as the first gray light of morning crept through the windows, her trunk already loaded, her cloak fastened against the cold. "Where are you going?" His voice was rough with sleep and something else, something closer to panic than she had ever heard from him. "Home, temporarily." She kept her voice steady, though her hands were not. "I think it is best, Alexander, while the pamphlet's claims are investigated, that I remove myself from the situation, rather than remain a target that draws further attention to the estate's instability. You think leaving will help. I think my presence has become a liability." "You think?" Alexander stopped, ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment looked entirely undone in a way she had never witnessed from him, not even in the depths of his grief over Charles. "Eleanor, I have spent the last week meeting with solicitors, not to distance myself from you, but to build the strongest possible case, proving the legitimacy of your birth, and therefore our marriage. I did not tell you because I did not want to burden you with legal detail while the outcome remained uncertain, and I see now what a mistake that silence was." Eleanor's breath caught. "You have been building a defense." "I have been building nothing else since the pamphlet appeared." His voice cracked slightly, the coldness she had once feared, entirely absent now, replaced by something raw and undefended. "I could not protect Charles. I have spent my whole life believing I am a man incapable of protecting the people who matter to me, and I was not going to let that be true again, not with you, not while there was breath left in me to fight it. And now you stand here with a trunk packed, prepared to leave before I even had the chance to tell you that." "I did not know," Eleanor said softly. "I know, that is my failure, not yours. I have spent so long believing that silence protects the people I love from the weight of my burdens, when in truth, it only leaves them to imagine the worst on their own." He crossed the hall, closing the distance between them, until he stood close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the sleepless nights that had gone into building whatever case he had constructed on her behalf. "Please, do not go. Not because the estate needs you, though it does, and not because appearances require it, though they will help. Stay because I am asking you to, as a man who has come to understand, far too slowly, that he cannot imagine this house, or this life, without you in it." The words hung between them, larger than either of them had allowed themselves to speak before. "Alexander," Eleanor said carefully, "do you understand what you are saying?" "I am saying that I love you," he said, and the words came out unsteady, imperfect, nothing like the practiced declarations of a man skilled in romance, and all the more devastating for their clumsiness. "I did not want to. I fought it for longer than I am proud of, but you walked into a marriage neither of us chose and gave it more honesty and more courage than I had any right to expect, and somewhere in the space of these past months, you became the one person in this world I trust completely, the one person whose absence I cannot imagine enduring. I love you, Eleanor, and I am asking you, humbly, to stay." Eleanor stood very still, the trunk forgotten beside her, the carriage waiting uselessly outside. She had not expected this. Not now, not delivered in the gray, uncertain light of an early morning departure that had nearly succeeded. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "Not of the pamphlet, of becoming a burden you would eventually resent, the way you resented this marriage in the beginning." "I could never resent you," Alexander said. "I resented the contract. I resented the circumstances that brought you here without either of us being asked. But you, Eleanor, you I have come, slowly and completely, to love." She reached up, and for the first time since their wedding day, she touched his face without hesitation, without calculation, simply because she wanted to. "Then I will stay," she said, "not because you asked me to, though I am glad you did. I will stay because I have come to love you as well, Alexander, more than I intended to, and more than I believed possible when I climbed those steps a stranger to you months ago." He kissed her then, properly, nothing like the empty formality of their wedding day, and Eleanor felt, for the first time in her life, the particular relief of being chosen by someone who could have chosen coldness instead, and chose her. The trunk was unpacked before noon, the carriage was sent away, and when the solicitor's inquiry concluded 3 weeks later, confirming beyond any doubt the legitimacy of Eleanor's birth, and dismantling the pamphlet's claims entirely, tracing its origin at last to a printer, secretly in Edmund Halloway's pay, Alexander stood before the assembled county at a hastily called gathering and said, plainly, for everyone to hear, that his wife was the finest and most courageous woman he had ever known, and that any further attempt to question her place at his side would be answered personally by him. Edmund Halloway did not appear at that gathering, nor any gathering after it. Whatever remained of his standing in the county collapsed entirely under the weight of his second failed scheme, and he retreated from public life so thoroughly that within a year most families had nearly forgotten his name. Eleanor and Alexander, however, were only beginning. Spring came to Ashcombe Manor the way it always did, slowly at first, and then all at once. Frost giving way to soft rain giving way to green shoots, pushing through soil that had been frozen for what felt, to Eleanor, like far longer than a single season. She stood at the edge of the garden one morning in early April, watching the roses she had spent months coaxing back to life finally begin to bud, and thought of how unrecognizable this place had become from the cold, unwelcoming house she had first entered as a stranger. Alexander found her there, as he often did now, his boots damp with dew from his morning ride, his expression none of the guarded coldness she remembered from those first difficult weeks. "You've been out here since dawn," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The roses are budding. I wanted to see it happen." He looked at the garden, really looked at it, the way he had avoided doing for years before her arrival. "Charles would have liked what you've done with this place." It was the first time he had spoken of his brother without the old flinch of guilt tightening his voice, and Eleanor understood, in that small shift, how far he had traveled since the night she found him alone on the stone bench beneath the dead roses. "Would you like to visit him?" she asked gently. "Together, I mean. It has been a long time since you last went." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and she thought perhaps she had asked too much, too soon, even now. But then he nodded, slowly, and reached for her hand. "Yes," he said. "I think I would like that very much, with you beside me." They walked together to the small family plot at the edge of the estate, where Charles had been laid to rest years before. The headstone weathered but well kept, tended quietly by Mrs. Prescott in all the years Alexander had been unable to bring himself to visit. Alexander knelt beside it for a long while, saying nothing at first, simply resting his hand against the cold stone the way he might once have rested it on his brother's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough. "I'm sorry I let you go alone that day. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back here. But I want you to know that I am no longer alone in the ways I once was, Charles. I found someone who taught me that grief does not have to be carried in silence, and that forgiveness, even for oneself, is possible." Eleanor stood a little apart, giving him the space the moment deserved. Her eyes bright with tears, she did not try to hide. When he finally rose and turned to her, his own eyes damp, she did not comment on it. She simply took his hand again, and they walked back toward the manor together in a silence that held none of the coldness it once had. Life at Ashcombe settled, in the months that followed, into something neither of them could have imagined on the day of their forced wedding. The estate flourished under their combined attention. Eleanor's careful management of the accounts, paired with Alexander's renewed dedication to his tenants, producing a prosperity the county had not seen from the Ashcombe lands in over a decade. The tenant families who had once regarded the young duke with wary distance now greeted him warmly when he rode through their fields, and more than one grateful family credited the new Duchess directly for improvements to their homes and livelihoods that no one had thought to make before her arrival. Mrs. Prescott, watching the transformation of the household she had served for 20 years, remarked to Eleanor one afternoon over tea that she had never imagined living to see the manor filled with such warmth again. "It has not always been an easy road, Mrs. Prescott," Eleanor said, smiling into her cup. "No, my lady, but the easy roads rarely lead anywhere worth arriving at." That evening, as the last light of day faded over the newly blooming garden, Alexander found Eleanor at the stone bench where he had once sat alone in the dark, nursing a grief he believed no one could ever help him carry. He sat beside her now, not alone, and took her hand in his without hesitation, without the old stiffness that had once defined every touch between them. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "the first night I found you here and told you to go inside? I remember. I have never been more grateful for your stubbornness in refusing me." Eleanor laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder, the warmth of him no longer a strange or unfamiliar thing, but something as steady and certain as the roses blooming around them. "I have never been more grateful for a great many things, Alexander, but most of all, I am grateful that a marriage which began as nothing more than a contract neither of us wanted, became, in the end, something real." "Something real," he echoed, turning to look at her in the fading light, his expression open in a way it had never been in those first cold weeks, a way that belonged now entirely to her. "I did not believe such a thing was possible for a man like me. I believed I had been shaped entirely by loss, by coldness, by a father who taught me that love was a weakness to be guarded against, rather than a gift to be given freely. You proved me wrong in every way a person can be proven wrong, Eleanor, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you refused to let me remain the man I was when you first arrived." "You did the harder part yourself," Eleanor said softly. "I only refused to look away. The choosing, the changing, the forgiving, that was always yours to do." "Then let me choose you again," Alexander said, "not because a will demanded it, not because a contract required it, but because there is no version of my life I want that does not have you standing at the center of it." He kissed her then, slow and certain, beneath a sky turning gold with the last light of day, in a garden that had once held nothing but grief, and now held, in equal measure, the quiet, hard-won joy of two people who had built something lasting out of the wreckage of a marriage neither of them had chosen. Outside the estate walls, the world continued much as it always had, indifferent to the private victories won inside one restored home. But within Ashcombe Manor, in the garden where roses bloomed again after years of neglect, a duke once known only for his cruelty, and a duchess once seen only as a convenient solution to a dying man's demand had become, Simply and completely, two people who loved each other freely, without contract, without obligation, and without any doubt at all that they had found, against every expectation either of them once held, exactly where they were meant to be.